You are about to enter the no superstition zone of rational thinking and intellectual curiosity here on the Atheist Forum. Standing by for your questions or comments at 727-441-3000, where you can talk to a real live atheist here on Tan Talk 1340.
This is Jim Peterson here with our Atheist Forum for this afternoon, and we have a special guest, two special guests actually. Not that all of our guests aren't special, but at any rate, Joe Reinhardt is here as usual to come up with some lively kind of consumption. Yes, indeed. And we also are quite privileged to have Eileen Stafford. Say something, Eileen.
Yes, hello everybody.
There you go. And Lucas Hopgood.
Hey, what's up?
Lucas is a member of the Tampa Humanist Association, and is a teacher and also a political advisor.
Activist.
Advisor. He's working on a campaign, so and doing quite well at it. But our topic today is one which I think you might be possibly interested in. It has to do with something called, what was it? Sex?
Polyamory.
Yes, sex.
And polyamory.
And sex. So anyway, we hope that you will stay tuned, because we will keep it clean, of course. Nobody's going to say any naughty words.
And for those of you who were thinking of changing the channel, let me repeat, this show is going to be about, the topic is going to be sex. Give them the call-in numbers for anybody seeking to either give or receive guidance. We'd love to hear from you. What are the numbers?
If you have any ideas at all about sex and where to get it, no, not that, but 727-441-3000. So we'd love to hear from you. And but let's go to our guest, Lucas, here, and find out more about polyamory. This subject has to do with a distinctive free thought humanist atheist approach to sexuality, and how individuals are free. We are always free. We've always been free, and so we wanted to know more about what some of those options might be, and perhaps you'd like to explain what polyamory might be.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Jim. So polyamory, while it isn't necessarily atheist or humanist, a lot of its roots are, and a lot of its practicing members are. Mm-hmm. It has its roots in a lot of the rejection of the stereotypical religious heteronormative societal rules that you have to be one man, one woman, in a marriage under Jesus, at least in American culture.
Heteronormative, could you explain that one?
Oh,
big word.
Heteronormative meaning always assuming one man and one woman for relationships. That's the normal way that things are done, and that's a word used to refer to it. Polyamory itself is a bastardized word where it has Greek and Latin roots of poly, meaning multiple, and amory, meaning love. And
so this has nothing to do with loving your parrot or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
It usually refers to relationships, and it is an umbrella term for everything beyond that standard religious-rooted heteronormative paradigm of different arrangements of numbers of people, gender, sexes, the connections between those people, how the level of whether the degree in the relationship is romantic or sexual, whether there's commitment. And swinging and open relationships are related, but they'd more fall into the umbrella of polyamory, but they have their own separate communities. For
It
the
sounds
most
as
part.
if the number of permutations of polyamorous relationships is beginning to approach the infinite. There does seem to be quite a few openings.
Exactly. It's pretty much
Positions
everything
available.
else, yes, than that standard relationship paradigm, which is for some people where a lot of other related primates are monogamous exclusively, some are polyamorous or polygamous exclusively, and some are in the middle, like bonobos. And most biologists will classify humans in that same monogamish category. So I think it's important to inform and educate people of the diversity of relationships available to them so they can choose whatever works for them, whether it is that standard monogamous relationship, which a lot of people it works for. But there are other people who want or need different things.
Now, this is a relatively new term, and how come we haven't heard of it before?
Polyamory as a term has its roots in the early 90s, but the actual movement behind it stretches back a lot further to a lot of the free love hippie era in the 60s, where there was that innovation in modern times of what a relationship can be about and against what it was previously.
And communal living was not, I mean,
Oh, yes,
That was
that can
the main
often
thing
be
during
part
the
of it.
Yeah, the whole
60s.
spectrum, exactly.
Yeah.
I think the way that this relates to religion, which is the subject that we is our main subject, and of course this incorporates under it very nicely, but I think the way it relates to religion in a couple of ways. One is that the idea of one man and one woman, although that's not what the Bible says, of course, but that has come to be the norm for so many people. But for the religious, it seems to me that they're not content with that. They're not happy to have one wife. They want you to have one wife or one spouse, depending on your gender. And it has to be the opposite gender from whatever you happen to be. And they're not content for them to have a mate of their choice and you to have a mate of your choice. I think the analogy to religion is the fact that one of the earliest things that does to a child, is to make them feel guilty about themselves, about their body, about their own thoughts, about their bodily functions, about their sex drive, about their genitalia, about their the size of their nose. Who knows? Just so you feel guilty enough to come down and let us sell you the cure. So I can see where the rise, I think, of polyamory has grown out of the 60s and out of the fact that more and more people are coming to see religion for the screaming fraud that it really is.
The demystification of sex, sexuality, genitalia, bodies, relationships, the advent of choice for women are all things that I think secular humanism exposes, in that polyamory is often a close examination of the options that you have available to you. So I also agree that it ties in well, even though there are, of course, religious polyamorous people as well.
Yeah, that's a novel suggestion. I hadn't heard about that.
Well, a common example people will bring up is Mormons. And the vast majority of Mormons are not actually practicing polyamory. That's only mostly small sects in the current era. They did in the past, but that was mostly just it was used as a tool to uphold the patriarchal and religious power that a lot of the leaders held. And it was not due to self-examination or self-reflection and understanding of relationships or looking for the best good. It was about power for them, whereas polyamory is a lot more about equality
And freedom.
dignity and communication and freedom. Yes.
I've seen some programs recently that described some of the, and not to focus on Mormonism per se, but where communities will actually outcast the male children because they represent some sort of competition for the existing
Well,
males.
The fundamentalist sect of Mormonism.
and that brings up a very important point about polygamy, because when people discuss polygamy, most often they talk about the hardships that it places on women and how they're almost held in slavery and subjugation. But in point of fact, it's extremely hard on the male community. I mean, typically, if you have a group of 100 people, 50 of them are women, 50 of them are men. Now, if one of those guys has 10 wives, or two of them have 10 apiece, that leaves 48 men to compete for the remaining 30 women, and it gets worse and worse, of course. So what we end up with is a lot of very sexually frustrated men.
You when you
the
think
very
about
least.
the privileges, you're thinking of the 2 or 3 or 10 men on top. You're not thinking of the 40 men on the bottom.
The 40 men are going to remain single. They're going to be incels all of their lives.
That's right.
Unless they decide,
Something like that.
unless they learn to become very good at masturbation. I'm sure they will.
Don't we all?
Don't we all? Yeah, everybody does that, I'm sure.
Stress relief.
Either that or homosexuality has to begin to look a lot more attractive too.
They've had that problem arise in China. Well, not problem, but to the state leadership, it was a problem of a lot of men in China are engaging in homosexual activities because of the gender disparity after the one-child policy
One
ended
child,
up warping the gender ratios in China.
The law of unintended consequences.
Yes, there's always that, because it's not simply a matter of the sexual pleasure that can be derived in the moment, but there's a lot of consequences to the arrangements that we make with our lives, and especially the emotional attachments, dependencies, and problems that can arise from any kind of relationship, whether it's monogamous or polygamous or polyandrous, whatever it is. Humans are complicated, and we're always going to be having trouble, but it's good that we should be aware of and know something about the way that others interrelate. You mentioned the bonobos. Now, many people are not aware, perhaps, of what a bonobo is. It's kind of like a chimpanzee. It's very physically similar to a chimpanzee, but it's the most advanced kind of ape, the closest to ourselves in its behavior, and as well as its physical appearance. They are a very loving species, so we say.
Absolutely,
Instead of
totally,
fighting
in our
Yes.
standards, amoral. They frequently greet each other with sex. They don't have anything approaching monogamous relationships. They engage in...
Well, I thought bonobos in particular did have them because they were classified as monogamish, I thought, where some of them engaged in it, but it wasn't the standard. Or is that a different type of ape?
I'm not sure. I've never heard read of a bonobo having a monogamous relationship. I know they often, as I say, greet each other with sex or fellatio, and they more or less have sex with what we would think of as total strangers, and they do it simply for pleasure, without any kind of commitment or guilt. If apes experience commitment or guilt, I really don't know, but I'll bet they do. They're pretty close to us. They're 99% the same DNA.
We say that they are an amoral species because they have this open sexuality. On the other hand, they don't have war. Chimpanzees will make war on each other.
I don't think they have mental health issues. I've never heard of them trying to commit suicide or any of the problems associated with the human condition.
I don't think any psychiatrist has undertaken any bonobo clients.
If I had to choose, I'm going with the bonobos myself. And
Yes.
believe me. So tell us some more. I know you had a lot more to tell us about polyamory.
Polyamory? Well, a big misconception is that it is cheating, and it's just everyone cheating, and that's not the case. Polyamory necessitates open and honest communication and consent for these relationships to be stable and form and to grow love within them. So it has respect and community and dignity as integrity as other things that are big crossovers with humanistic values.
How can it be cheating if if your partner or partners,
Yeah.
you do it with their knowledge and consent?
That's exactly it. If they know about it and they're okay with it, it's not cheating.
And if they don't know about it and it's not okay with them, then it's not polyamory.
Yeah, you can still cheat in a polyamorous relationship. Certainly.
Is it
Bring
run
it
like a
as well.
democracy, like as far as like when everybody sits down and you discuss something, does everybody have a point of view that gets, or is it?
Generally,
Yeah.
because it's just as normal relationships. If you're talking with friends, it's that sort of atmosphere a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Often also in polyamorous relationships, you aren't necessarily in relationships with people that your partners are in relationships with. Although there can be terms like throuple you may have heard of, which is three
What is that
couple.
again? Thruple?
Throuple.
3 couples?
Throuple,
Well,
so three
yeah.
people in a couple.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Another
It's a menage a
bastardization.
trois multiplied by 2?
Well.
No. It's three people
like two
in a
guys
stable
and one
relationship.
woman, or
So-
2 women and 1 guy.
I
Yeah,
see.
it can be either.
Or three women,
throuple.
three guys,
Well,
whatever you
I
like.
agree.
Non-binary people are
Yeah.
welcome generally.
I don't know what, polyamory has done for the culture in terms of making it a better and happier world to live in, but it's done wonders for the vocabulary and the language.
Just in the last 15
power.
minutes.
Yeah, more power to it.
The that is definitely a thing where a lot of these concepts have gone unexamined historically and especially in mainstream culture. So like the LGBT community at large, they are often accused of just making stuff up, whereas really a lot of the time they're inventing new words to describe concepts that exist, and that those inventing words clarifies things for people. If you've heard of, what are some terms that are even more obscure? Demisexuality, gray sexuality are both a-spectrum things.
Demisexuality?
Demi and gray sexual. And also stuff like heteroromantic, but bisexual are other terms you could use. So that term
I'm
would
so confused.
Well.
I'm not sure what to do to get a date.
Well, in this sort of community, for polyamory, it would be self-examination and be yourself and figure out what you want and go after it honestly.
Well, if you're a male, you typically have one thing that you want.
And what's that, Jim?
I hesitate to say on the air,
Okay.
but I think everyone is acquainted with what
Love?
it might be.
Yes.
I have stated in the past as a male that every man, speaking for every man, the first thing when they see a woman, particularly one they've never seen before, see a woman, the first thing that flashes through their mind, even if for only a nanosecond, is to imagine that woman in bed.
Well,
And sometimes the reaction to that is, "Ugh," but it's there every time.
Whose
there's
reaction?
of course
Yours or theirs?
gay men and
Both.
asexual men and men with perhaps different views on things, maybe due to being raised culturally different. There's lots of
every man,
variety
who looks, thinks, and acts like me. In other words, who's normal.
Okay, so and that's the term heteronormative refers to, is that
Yes.
sort of normative ways to relate to sex and relationships and the expression that goes along with it.
And what we need here is a woman's point of view.
Yes.
Well, okay, my viewpoint about relationships, like, you were saying about the, sorry. How long do these relationships last? I mean, it's like sort of, I get into a relationship with somebody within the first 6 months, I know whether or not it's going to last. And then after 18 months on board. That's sort of for my age group anyway.
Well, funny enough, there is a term,
Yes.
it's serial monogamy. Which is where you're going partner after partner, but it's staying monogamous to them.
Right, yeah.
For polyamory in particular, most relationships that I'm aware of that are polyamorous are in fact long-term. I'm in long-term polyamorous relationships myself. While it's certainly not frowned upon in the polyamorous community, and there's no slut shaming or
Yeah.
looking down on people for shorter term relationships or any other preference they might have, usually they gravitate towards more swinging communities or open relationships or stuff like that. Whereas polyamory as a community generally focuses on those sort of long-term multiple relationships with lots of depth and intimacy and emotional connection.
Okay, yeah, because I was just wondering as far as.
And yes, the girls have multiple partners too. In case you're
Yeah, because
generally
what it comes
speaking.
down to is when your children come involved with the relationship, that's when things change. So I was wondering with the polyamorous, does that affect anything with, all of a sudden the personalities change because somebody's more involved with kids rather than being with their adult partners,
Well,
and stuff like that.
They say it takes a village to raise a child,
Yeah,
and
yeah, which I-
polyamorous people are exceptionally good at that because
Yeah.
enough connections and you do have a village already going.
Yeah, I feel like we're going back to the caveman time where the women raised the kids, the men went out hunting and brought back the food and stuff, and it was like you say, everybody as a community worked together with the children.
Well,
from what I understood.
the
Yeah.
community does work together for that sort of thing, but
Yeah.
by and large, there's a lot more equality and equity in the polyamorous community. There's certainly people who do like those relationship dynamics of the sort of submissive stay-at-home woman and the man going out to hunt.
Yeah.
But there's everything else. You can certainly have women being the breadwinners and the men looking after the children, just like in monogamous relationships
Yeah.
and monoamorous relationships. But children do change things for polyamorous relationships, just as they do for normal ones.
Yeah.
The one thing I have heard, because I don't have kids myself, but I have heard it's from people who have done it both ways.
More than you can ever imagine.
I've heard that it's easier in polyamorous communities because there's just
Because
more people,
more adult supports, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
and there's a lot more of a safety net with more adults as well.
Well, now,
Although there is discrimination faced against polyamorous people
Yeah,
concerning children.
Yeah.
one objection some people might have concerns children within that occur within such a relationship, and the question is, would they not be confused, and would they not be unable to properly channelize a gender role for themselves based upon their own observations as children of the interactions of their parent or parents. Now, how do polyamorous people who are forming a community and wish to maintain it, and in dealing with children, how do they meet with that problem?
By and large, their reaction is meh or destroy it. That I'm encountered. There's certainly people who support that sort of thing, but most polyamorous people that I'm aware of don't particularly favor assigning gender roles to children, just as the same as they wouldn't want to impose a religion on a child. They would want to educate them and let them choose for themselves.
People pick their own gender oftentimes in spite of overwhelming problems, so I don't see where that would be a problem. In fact, I think it would be
Yeah.
the reverse, because there'd be no pressure to be pushed in some gender direction that's contrary to what your normal predisposition might be.
Okay, we're going to step back for a little bit here and make some way for a little commercial time to tell you a little bit about us, and so stay tuned.
Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com.
And this one's still plugged in, I hope.
Okay, so we're back, and now we have, we're going to take a little break from the conversation, but we'll be getting back to that. Promises to be pretty exciting, and your input is desired. Just feel free to call us at 727-441-3000. Joe, I believe you have some insights, some words of wisdom to grace this part of the hour.
Well, I do, Jim. You believe correctly. In fact, they are words of wisdom, because I know they're words of wisdom because I stole them from a very smart guy,
All right.
Voltaire, to be exact, who said, "To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize."
Well, increasingly, we know who that is.
Increasingly, that
currently.
just seems so topical in spite of the fact that it's several hundred years old.
Yeah, we're part of the lying press here, I believe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I hope so.
Lucas, welcome back. I was just explaining to Jim that I do have some experience along these lines, having worked for some time at the Jimmy Swaggart Home for Unwed Mothers.
Yeah.
We're all laughing here for some reason. Go on, Joe.
In any case, you're far more informed on this subject than I could ever hope to be, and I'd like to hear more about it. So why don't we just go right on talking about polyamory?
All right. What would you like to hear about?
Well, I think Jim we had left off with the idea of whether or not it has a negative effect on children, because there's some confusion as to what gender role they should select, as if you select it as a, it's a sort of, it selects you, I think. So
Yes.
I don't see why that would be a problem. But what other pros and cons? I mean, I think it's still in St. Petersburg, your landlord can have you evicted. You could even be arrested if they prove you're cohabiting.
We don't want to spread that around now, do we?
Yeah, and a lot of areas have zoning laws that facilitate discrimination against polyamorous people. They're not usually directly targeted at them, but they'll also target immigrants, because you'll have often immigrant families, or you'll have lots of men who are immigrants cohabitating as they do work, migrant workers. People of color, and some other groups they're all often discriminated under those same laws. It's generally what you wouldn't picture in 1960s America as the stereotype. That'll be what's discriminated against.
Even though
under a
their
lot of
sex
those
lives
laws.
are perfectly banal and
Yes.
conventional. But,
Yeah, but really what it comes down to is that when you sign a lease, as long as, the two people, whoever signs the lease pays the rent and this and that, but I guess what they're considering is if you're not married or in a regular relationship, that maybe you'll break up and leave, and all of a sudden everybody's left with not paying the bill.
Any lender, including
Right.
your bank,
Yeah.
if they decide that you are living an immoral lifestyle, or that there's some reason to think that you are an immoral person, they can accelerate the loan and sue you for all of the payments at the same time. That way they don't have to sue you for each individual payment. So if the bank doesn't like you for some reason, maybe you happen to run afoul of the bank president's daughter, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You could find yourself out in the street simply because they think you're immoral.
Well, I do think being a polyamorous atheist would qualify me for that, certainly.
Yeah, right. You deserve to be living in a box somewhere under a bridge. Yeah.
Thank you. My imagination.
you got something at least.
Yeah.
Okay,
But,
so I believe a topic that you brought up earlier, just before the show, was jealousy, and how that relates to polyamorous relationships. And that is probably the biggest concern that I've encountered when I talk about polyamory to people, is they say, "Oh, there's no way I could ever do that. I'd be too jealous." Or what if I'm not jealous? That means what do I feel for that partner then? And the polyamorous community generally has a different view on jealousy, that it is a lot of the times built up in people's heads, their own reactions, and it's the fear of jealousy more than actual jealousy that's a problem. Because they usually, and I will usually address any jealousy in a relationship, you talk to your other partner about it. Generally, if you're jealous of something, that means you want more from that partner, or you want that experience with that partner. So it's an opportunity to expand your relationship, or potentially get another one, or lots of other things. There's also a phenomenon witnessed and named, here's another vocabulary word for you, in the polyamory community, compersion.
compersion.
That's correct.
Nothing to do with Persia,
No.
I assume.
And compersion is often just sort of referred to as the opposite of jealousy. It's being enthused that your partner is happy and spending time with someone they're happy with. Just as the same, you might be happy that someone is able to spend time with their friend and gain new experiences. It's pretty much that exact same thing, but often deeper because of the stronger connection that you'll have to people.
Well, now, when you enter into a polyamorous relationship, you do so in a fully conscious, deliberate way, so that everybody getting into it understands what is expected of them. And what is expected is what you've been describing, that it's going to be a mutually satisfying relationship all the way around, and everybody's going to do their best to try to make themselves conform to the expected behavior. Is that not the case?
I wouldn't say necessarily conform to the expected behavior. It's more
In other words,
Just-
they're going to be less reactive in their approach to the others in this relationship.
as in you mean they aren't gonna like get violent with the person sleeping with their other partner, or
I don't necessarily mean violence. Not, I hope not. But just simply
A negative reaction of
Oh,
some
negative
sort.
reaction.
There is various
Oh, yeah.
ways which we all relate, and it's not all equal.
Yeah, generally that would
Equality is
be
very difficult.
a problem in a polyamorous relationship, and you'd want to talk about it. I will say that it's what you were saying earlier. It's not inherent to polyamorous relationships, but I would say that's inherent to an ethical polyamorous relationship. Just the same as you can be in a monogamous or relationship and you can cheat, lie, and steal and do all sorts of terrible things to your partner. It just wouldn't be a very ethical relationship.
Most partners object to most of that, I think. Something to think about.
Yeah. Mine beat me if I do that. I'm kidding.
No, that would never happen. Okay, we're still here at 727-441-3000, awaiting your input into the things we're talking about. And what we're talking about is sex.
That's right.
And we know you have some opinion.
And the things around
Don't be
it.
shy.
Yes, right. Some of you probably have a sex drive that's too high, which is to say it's all in your head. So it would be a good idea to call in and get some advice on polyamory. Do your sex drive a lot of good, I think. I don't want to digress too far, but I do have a personal anecdote I'd like to relate. I'm lucky enough to go to Amsterdam every year to play poker in a tournament there, and people frequently ask me, and I think it applies to polyamorous relationships because prostitution is legal in Amsterdam, and it's quite prevalent. It's not actually limited to the red light district. It's much more around than you might imagine. And people ask me if my wife knows what goes on in Amsterdam. My wife of 45 years, I might add, and I like to tell them the truth, which is that she doesn't really care how many other women I disappoint.
Well, prostitution doesn't have much of a relation to polyamory per se, and that there isn't any inherent crossover. There are a disproportionate amount of sex workers in the polyamorous community, just as there are in the LGBT community. I think there's a lot of potential reasons for that. There's a lot more accepting attitudes towards sex, and they're often less likely to expect violence in living with those sort of people or around them and interacting with them. And they also generally have done a lot more self-examination on how they relate to sex and relationships, and sometimes polyamory ends up being what they choose, and more often than not, or more often than the baseline population, purely because they've examined it, whereas the average person may not have.
Now, I know we haven't actually mentioned this, but I know that Lucas is a former, one-time, erstwhile Mormon, which, of course, we mentioned polygamy earlier, and he talked about that. So we did mention it indirectly, I think. And Jen had
Before I was 16 years old,
Right,
specifically.
but Jim had posed
I'm the
this,
young
this
here.
question earlier. Do you think being a Mormon and at least being exposed to the idea of polygamy has affected or increased the likelihood that you would become a polyamorous person that you have endorsed?
That's a good question, and I would say it's actually had the opposite effect, where the exposure that I saw a lot more historically, because it's not particularly practiced, especially outside of the fundamentalist sects, which I was not a part of. But the older versions a few hundred years ago, for the most part, were mostly just used to uphold the patriarchy and the power of the religious leaders, and I didn't like that. I was all for equality, and so I would say my exposure was actually somewhat negative to the idea of multiple marriages.
Well, it must have been extraordinary for you as a young Mormon growing up to find yourself in a position where you became an advocate for equality. I mean, that's such a rare thing for anybody anywhere these days.
Particularly any
So-
religious group. I mean, equality is
Yes.
the bottom of the scale for them.
To what do
It's
you-
a hierarchy.
To what do you attribute that? I mean, ideas you had self-exposure to
Well,
something different?
I was and I am still pretty sickly, but especially as a child. So I was missing lots of school, and I just stayed in bed and read. So I wasn't getting much exposure, interaction with peers. I wasn't doing much with my parents either. It was a lot of reading. So I had a lot of exposure to Tamora Pierce was my favorite author growing up, and she wrote on a lot of body issues. Her most famous character undergoes her period in her first novel and has to deal with that while not knowing what's going on, and is in relationships with multiple people and is having to navigate that, along with other writers, which I thought had a tremendous effect on me growing up. A lot of Asimov, actually.
Isaac Asimov.
Isaac Asimov.
Asimov.
Asimov,
Yeah,
yes.
whatever. Okay.
I just read it, yeah.
No, I will do another quick quote. He said that the Bible is the greatest source for atheism of any book ever written.
And that's true enough. We, in fact, here highly recommend, I think, speaking for all of us, that you read the Bible very carefully.
Right.
Really.
I would recommend, because the Bible is almost impossible to read. It's a lot of gibberish. It puts you to sleep. And it can't be understood if you read it linearly. You have to read Promise A and then read the Promise A in the next book and in the next book. So you're better off to read books about the Bible than to read the Bible itself. Let the other people do the slogging through the mud, and you can get right to the
But if you can do that slog, you'll find that a lot of the references in the Bible to all kinds of human behavior, but sexual behavior in particular, tend to be distinctly negative. If you do something a little bit outside of what the tribe or the God recommends, why, the punishment is death. Death for almost everything.
except for the Book of Solomon, or the Song of Solomon, which I understand if it hadn't been expurgated, they wouldn't be able to publish it because they couldn't get it by the censors and the pornography laws. I mean, it describes how the woman describes that his cum was, or his spend was like that of a stallion, and it comes all over her chest. I mean,
Well, I don't know if we. Okay.
Mark Twain said that the earliest parts of the Bible that every boy learns are the parts that he can masturbate.
Well, it's important that you master all aspects of our culture.
I agree. Mark
Certainly
Twain
that
thought
is
so
one
too.
of the primary sources for a good deal of what has become Western civilization. But it's become that because we've grown out of it, not because we've grown into it. So, which is one of the reasons why we have programs like this, because we want to educate people. And
We've
show them.
become more moral in spite of it, not
That's
because
right.
of it. That's the
Exactly.
end of the argument as to whether or not religion is good for society.
I have a quote here from psychologist Davison and Neal, the people who wrote the classic textbook Abnormal Psychology. And they say, up to this point, wherever religious neurosis has appeared on earth, we find it tied up with three dangerous rules. Dietary rules, isolation, fasting, and sexual abstinence. And it's this last one that has promoted a good deal of the problems that, well, things like the Catholic Church is experiencing with children and so forth.
Well, the second one as well, actually.
Yes, the
The isolation, wasn't it?
isolation.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And polyamory is a very explicit rejection of that, in that you are not isolating yourself, you are reaching out to form connections with people freely.
And it's a much greater
And allowing them to
intimacy.
develop however they will.
St. Augustine is a good example of how religion has screwed up society for millennia. He decided he wanted to be celibate. Unfortunately, he couldn't stop having sexual thoughts. And naturally, he blamed that on women. There's nothing new about that, okay?
Of course.
But the idea that women are sinful, or women cause men to be sinful because they engender sinful thoughts and thoughts of sex, St. Augustine is one of the primary proponents of that idea. And of course, he's the intellectual leader of the Catholic Church.
That does indeed relate to polyamory, in that in polyamorous relationships, by and large, you're the one taking responsibility for your libido. Whereas in a monogamous relationship, you've got one option, they've got one option, either they're fulfilling your needs or they're not. Let's get a divorce, honey, if they're not. Or suffer through. Whereas in a polyamorous relationship, there's options, there's room for creativity, expression, negotiation, compromise, and development of the relationship.
Communication.
Exactly.
So many women, I think, are unable or unwilling to just tell a man, here's what I want you to do. And I don't know about most men, but I personally love guidance. I don't even have to think for myself, just show me what you like.
Yeah, and
It's not that complicated.
there's
You ought to know. I mean, not you, but she,
I
the
understand.
woman. If you don't know, who does?
I would say that goes both ways. Or if you talk to women, they'll often express problems with men telling them what they want them to do in bed and in relationships. And there's mutual talking past each other. And I think a lot of that is the cultural dance around what's taboo to say and what's not, and the education on knowing what to say or how to approach things, or developing a vocabulary. to
I
talk
don't
about
want my
those
partner
issues.
to think I'm sick or perverted or,
Well, why not?
Thank you, Jesus, for this steamy sex we're about to receive. Hence the term missionary position, right?
Yeah, it's hot stuff.
Yeah, hot stuff.
Well, is that where the term comes from?
The missionary
Yeah.
position? I believe it is, yes.
All right.
There's only one proper position to have sex in, and anything else is a perversion.
Okay, and that's through the sheet with the lights off?
Yes,
that one.
you probably, do you know what a bundling board was?
Yes, actually.
Back
There are
in
a lot of-
colonial times.
Yeah, a lot of jokes about how many marriages and how many children were the consequence of a importune knothole.
Well. Anyway, so, yes?
I guess you could say you had some kindly parents not see how that would be an issue.
Yes. What's this about Nazis? I don't know.
Nazis.
No, that's a totally different thing. But I do think that the criticism advanced by our experts here has sufficient power that everybody can relate to it. As Joe was pointing out, Saint Augustine was the first to proclaim that women were a primary source of impurity and sin and all this other crap. And of course, St. Paul, too, had his hang-ups.
Well,
And,
also Eve, with the accepting the apple,
Well,
taking
Pandora's box,
Pandora's
I mean,
box, yeah.
take your pick.
There's lots of historical precedent.
Oh, yeah.
But the Greeks and Romans and their various gods had a much more equitable relationship. The way in which sex was much more casual. It was done between men and men, and women and men,
And swans.
You know,
and children.
I wouldn't
Things
necessarily.
not acceptable today, but still at that time.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement, where the sex was more casually done, but I wouldn't say it was more equitable. Where it was, by and large, still people in positions of power.
Sure.
Yeah.
They were the ones doing the sex on other people, and you can see in a lot of the Greek myths for Greek and Roman mythology, it was not Zeus or Apollo or Dionysus doing a tasteful chase role play with a young maiden or a nymph. They were raping them. You can see it in
Zeus turned
all of
himself
them.
into a swan so he could have sex with Leda while she swam.
Hephaestus had a famous attempted rape of Athena. Apollo had a famous myth where a nymph turned herself into a tree to avoid him.
Yes, I remember. There's a
And-
statue of that.
There's plenty of, so many
Cupid
examples
and
of it's
Psyche,
about power a lot of the time.
But the
So I wouldn't say equity, although it was more casual.
in ancient times, those societies were very much class divided, and their sexual practices and mores reflected that, along with their religion. So it all worked out for them. so to
Slavery was
speak.
very common, too.
Yes,
In
slaves were often at the
slavery
bottom of the.
and polyamory are, I think, at the opposite ends of the scale.
Very much so, where you aren't really doing that sort of thing in a polyamorous relationship unless there's consent around it and communication, and it's informed consent.
And informed communication, and that's what we try to propose here. We have, let's see, what else do we have here?
Are we doing the ending here?
Yeah, well, not
No,
quite
we've got
yet.
about
No,
5
you're not
minutes.
also up here. No, we still got about another 6-7 minutes. And so the question is, why is sex fun?
Dopamine.
Dopamine.
Yeah,
That's what's
dopamine,
fun.
oxytocin, serotonin. Next question? No, wait, no, we're up or
What
next.
about,
easy.
what about the female capacity to enjoy sex is exponentially greater than men? The clitoris has something like multiple times
Nerve
more,
endings.
more
That was also a Greek
nerve
myth
endings
with
than
Tiresias, the blind seer, who was turned into a woman by Zeus and declared that women, in fact, have more sexual pleasure than men. While that's certainly a possibility, in practice, there is an orgasm gap between men and women, where most of the time during sex, men are going to orgasm, and it's a chance for women on average. Certainly, some will have none ever, some will have multiple. And I think removing the taboos and the education and increasing the communication are all things that will facilitate that. As a specific point, most people aren't necessarily aware that women have a lot more anatomical variation when it comes to pleasure. Where men, everyone can do the shake weight motion and it'll work by and large, give it enough time and speed, however it works. Whereas for women, some women will want clitoral stimulation exclusively or none at all. Some will want G-spot stimulation exclusively or not at all. Some need both. And there's also a lot more brain connections in women to a lot of other areas of the body. For example, the area for genital stimulation in the brain lights up when nipples are stimulated for women and not for men. So by and large, it's that sort of education on the variety of human diversity and how to approach it and communicate about it is something that can very much help with. And that's, of course, something you can do in a polyamorous or a monogamous relationship. Or if you're single,
Yeah.
all the ladies out there who are lonely tonight, keep that in mind.
One big word, foreplay.
There we go. Lots of lube. Always bring
It's a
lube.
very difficult question to resolve, is who's having more fun? Because in each case, it's entirely subjective.
Yeah.
So how would you measure that? There is no measure. For,
Well,
Or is there?
there's some ways to measure that. If you're just using
brain
orgasms as a
scans,
measurement, as I was saying, in practice there is an orgasm gap, and brain scans. Because the Kinsey Institute, for example, is one of the premier sex research organizations in the United States. And they've been able to amass bodies of knowledge on the differences in pleasure that men and women will experience during sex, and the everything around sex that can influence that. For example, how power dynamics in a relationship will affect physical intimacy, because a lot of the time you'll have power dynamics that weren't necessarily agreed upon influence the way that sex proceeds, because someone might not want to bring up something, or they might not feel empowered to ask for something for a partner, or there might be taboos in place as a part of that power structure that can all influence sex despite not being a de facto physical part of the act.
So how a society is organized, who has power, and how is that power distributed, has a lot to do with the lives lived by ordinary people, even right down to something as intimate as sexuality.
Hashtag me too.
Exactly. Hashtag down with the bourgeoisie.
There are multiple hashtags associated with all this, and I think this has been one of the more interesting hours that we've passed, and certainly I've learned a great deal, and I hope you have too. We're coming to the. Does anybody have any concluding thoughts that you would like to share for 30 seconds or so?
I have one I can actually share, and that is a good resource if you want to know more about polyamory is lovemore.com, and take it away.
Are there
More
meetups?
not less.
Are there meetups as well?
There are lots of meetups. You can probably
Just
them
Google
as
it
well.
under meetups.
Yes. A lot of the time, the BDSM community will also host those because polyamory is often of concern to them as well, and those are usually labeled munches. So that's another term that can be used to look
Munches?
them up. Munches, yes.
Munches.
Munch.
Okay.
As in, like chew. Munch.
Yeah.
Oh,
They're
okay.
usually at lunchtime events that are totally non-sexual, just for discussion and education and community.
Eileen, have you anything to offer?
No, it's just that I had seen something where they did have some weekends of some things, and people would wear different colored bracelets depending on what they were into. So that was
That's like
just,
the old hanky code.
Yeah. That's the only thing. But I mean, you know, again,
We're coming to the end here, down the home stretch, and I hope you join us again next week on the Atheist Forum, along with Joe Reinhardt,
The Atheist Forum.
Eileen.
To learn more about Atheists of Florida, visit our
And Luke.
website at
I'm here to say, if the
atheistofflorida.com.
story seems a little too
Continue the
plausible to be
discussion on
true,
our
don't believe
website,
it,
Talk
because